The vibration of my phone on the granite countertop sounded like a gunshot in the silent kitchen. I wiped my flour-dusted hands on my apron, expecting a grocery reminder from my husband, but instead, the screen displayed a message from my mother-in-law that turned my blood into shards of ice. "I added those drops to her soup, Mark. Now we just wait for her to drift off so we can get her thumbprint on the transfer. Don't be late." For a heartbeat, I stared at the words, the warmth of the home I had built with my own sweat and savings, suddenly feeling like a tomb. The drops weren't the herbal supplement Margaret had been lovingly stirring into my bowls for weeks. They were a sedative, and my husband wasn't my protector. He was the vulture waiting for me to stop moving. To understand how I ended up a prisoner in my own kitchen, staring at a death warrant sent by mistake, you have to understand what this house meant to me. It wasn't just real estate. It was a 3-story Victorian masterpiece on the edge of the historic district, a crumbling ruin of mahogany and stained glass that I had spent 5 years and every penny of my inheritance restoring. I remember the smell of sawdust and old wax that seemed to permeate my skin during those first months. I had sanded the grand staircase myself until my palms were raw and blistered, uncovering the deep, honeyed glow of the original wood. Every tile in the foyer was hand-laid. Every crown molding was a labor of obsessive love. It was my sanctuary, my fortress, and, legally, it was mine alone, inherited from my grandmother with a rock-solid clause that kept it out of any marital assets. Mark had entered my life when the house was halfway finished. He was a high school history teacher with a gentle smile and a way of looking at me that made me feel like the most important person in the room. He didn't mind the dust on my clothes, or the fact that our dates often involved picking out plumbing fixtures at salvage yards. He seemed to admire my independence. "You're a force of nature, Elena," he used to say, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. We married in the garden I had planted, under the shade of a willow tree that felt like an old friend. For the first 2 years, our life was a quiet symphony of domestic bliss. I ran my architectural consulting firm from the home office, and Mark brought me coffee every morning at precisely 8 a.m. The only discord in our melody was his mother, Margaret. From the moment she stepped over the threshold, she treated my house like a personal affront. She would run a gloved finger over the mantelpiece, sighing at a speck of dust, or comment on how impersonal the modern kitchen felt. "It's a bit much for one woman to manage, don't you think, dear?" she'd ask, her voice like honey laced with arsenic. "A house this size needs a family. It needs proper management." I always laughed it off, thinking it was just the typical friction of a woman losing her only son to another. But then came the leak. 6 months ago, Margaret claimed a pipe had burst in her apartment, rendering it unlivable. Mark, ever the dutiful son, didn't even ask. He simply brought her over with 3 suitcases and a look of pleading desperation. "It's just for a few weeks, Elle," he promised, kissing my forehead. "She has nowhere else to go." Those weeks turned into months. Margaret didn't just move in, she colonized. She rearranged my spice rack, complaining that my organization made no sense. She replaced my linen curtains with heavy, oppressive velvet drapes that blocked out the sun I loved. But most disturbingly, she began to focus on my health. It started with a lingering flu that I just couldn't shake. My usual boundless energy evaporated, replaced by a heavy, leaden fatigue that made it difficult to climb the stairs I had so carefully restored. My head felt permanently wrapped in cotton wool. Margaret was suddenly there at every turn, a shadow in a floral apron. "You're working too hard, Elena. Your constitution was always so delicate," she'd murmur, pressing a cool cloth to my forehead. "Let me take care of the cooking. You need nutrition. My special broth will put the color back in your cheeks." The special broth became a staple. Every evening, she would bring a steaming bowl to my bedside or my desk. It had a slightly bitter aftertaste, hidden under layers of thyme and garlic. I trusted her. Why wouldn't I? She was family. And Mark stood by, watching with a look of concerned devotion, often rubbing my shoulders as I struggled to keep my eyes open after dinner. "She's a saint, Mark," I whispered one night, my voice slurring as the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and warp. "She just wants what's best for us, honey," he replied. His voice sounded far away, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. Just sleep. Everything will be handled. I didn't notice the way they started whispering in the hallway when they thought I was asleep. I didn't notice the way Mark began to ask pointed questions about the transferability of my grandmother's trust, or how Margaret would linger in my office, her eyes scanning the deed I kept in a locked drawer. A drawer I eventually found pried open, though I convinced myself I had simply forgotten to lock it in my brain fog. That fog was my constant companion. I felt my life slipping away, a slow erosion of my will and my intellect. I stopped taking on new clients. I stopped seeing my friends. My world shrunk to the dimensions of my bedroom and the taste of that bitter, savory soup. I was becoming a ghost in my own home, a breathing shadow that only existed to be cared for by the two people I loved most. Until that Tuesday evening. Mark was supposed to be at a parent-teacher conference, and Margaret had told me she was going to the pharmacy to pick up more of my supplements. I was in the kitchen, trying to muster the strength to boil a pot of tea, my movements slow and uncoordinated. Margaret had left her phone on the charger next to the stove, a rare oversight for a woman so meticulously organized. Then, the ping. I leaned over, my vision blurring for a second before the words snapped into sharp, horrifying focus. I added those drops to her soup, Mark. Now we just wait for her to drift off so we can get her thumbprint on the transfer. Don't be late. The room began to spin. Not the gentle, dizzy spin of my illness, but a violent, nauseating whirl. The drops. The transfer. The thumbprint. They weren't waiting for me to get better. They were waiting for me to be incapacitated enough to steal the one thing I had left. The house wasn't just a building to them. It was a payday, a multi-million-dollar asset they intended to strip from my limp, drugged hands. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at the pot of soup simmering on the stove, the soup Margaret had lovingly prepared before she stepped out. The steam rising from it suddenly smelled like betrayal. I felt a surge of heat in my chest, a spark of the old Elena, the one who had sanded floors until she bled, fighting through the chemical haze in my brain. I heard the front door click open, the heavy thud of Mark's boots in the foyer. "Elena? Honey? You're out of bed?" His voice called out, laced with a false, saccharine concern that made me want to scream. I stood paralyzed, the phone still glowing in my hand, as the man I thought was my soulmate walked into the kitchen, his eyes darting immediately to the stove, and then to me. The mask hadn't slipped yet, but the air in the room had turned lethal. Looking back, the warning signs hadn't just been there, they had been screaming, muffled only by my own desperate desire to believe in the sanctity of my marriage. For months, the atmosphere in the house had shifted from a sanctuary to a courtroom where I was the unwitting defendant. It started with the clutter. Margaret began moving my architectural blueprints and legal folders, claiming she was just tidying up for my own good. When I couldn't find my tax returns or the original deed to the house, Mark would sigh, a sound of heavy, performative patience. "Elena, love, you put them in the hall closet, don't you remember? You've been so scattered lately. Maybe it's the stress." I had looked at my own hands, which were usually so steady when drafting intricate elevations, and seen them trembling. I'd find the stove left on, or the front door wide open in the middle of the night, and Margaret would be there, a silhouette in her silk robe, clicking her tongue. "It's a blessing I'm here, dear. Imagine if you were alone in this big, dangerous house in your condition." "My condition?" I had asked, my voice thin. "I have the flu, Margaret. I'm not losing my mind." "Of course not," she'd say, her eyes glittering with a predatory sharpness. "But memory is a fragile thing. Mark and I were talking. Perhaps we should look into a power of attorney, just as a precaution, to protect you from your own mistakes." Mark had reinforced it every night. He'd sit on the edge of the bed, the lamp casting long, distorted shadows across the room, and talk about simplifying our lives. "The house is a burden, Elle. It's eating you alive. My mother knows a developer who's interested in the historic district. We could sell, move into something smaller, something easier for you to manage. I hate seeing you like this. pale, confused, always exhausted. He had been laying the groundwork, brick by brick, building a prison of concern around me. I had ignored the way he avoided my gaze when I mentioned seeing a specialist for my fatigue. I ignored the way he had quietly changed the passwords on our joint accounts for security. I was a professional woman who had built a career on precision and structural integrity, yet I was allowing the foundation of my own life to be undermined because I loved the man holding the shovel. Now, in the kitchen, the truth wasn't a slow realization, it was a violent collision. Mark took a step toward me, his hand reaching out, his face still wearing that practiced mask of gentle worry. "Elena? Why do you have my mother's phone? You look distressed. Here, give it to me. You're shaking again." The shaking wasn't the tremors of my illness anymore. It was a cold, rhythmic vibration of pure, unadulterated fury. My heart didn't just beat, it slammed against my ribs, a dull, heavy thud that echoed in my ears like a funeral drum. My skin felt electric, a prickly, nauseating heat spreading from my chest to my fingertips. The world didn't just slow down, it fractured into 1,000 sharp, high-definition details. The way a bead of sweat stood out on Mark's upper lip, the faint smell of his expensive cologne, the sound of the clock on the wall ticking like a countdown. "The drops, Mark?" My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone colder, someone who had already died and come back with a grudge. "The thumbprint transfer? How long have you been planning to sedate me into signing over my life?" Mark stopped. His hand froze in midair. For a split second, the mask flickered. The gentle husband vanished, replaced by something hollow and calculating. He didn't deny it. He didn't gasp in shock. He simply looked at the phone in my hand and then back at me, his eyes narrowing. "Elena, you're not well. You're hallucinating. You've been having these episodes for weeks. That text, it's a joke. A misunderstanding. Give me the phone." "I'm not hallucinating the soup, Mark," I whispered, my eyes darting to the spice rack where Margaret always kept her special ingredients. With a burst of energy I didn't know I still possessed, I lunged for the small, decorative wooden box she kept tucked behind the flour canister. Mark moved to block me, but I was faster, fueled by a frantic, primal adrenaline. I grabbed the box and flipped it open. Inside, nestled among the cinnamon sticks and bay leaves, was a small, amber glass bottle with no label, only a handwritten M on the cap. I held it up, my hand finally going stone still. The weight of that tiny bottle felt heavier than the house itself. Is this the nutrition she's been giving me? Is this why I can't walk to the mailbox without wanting to collapse? The silence that followed was suffocating. Mark stood there, his shadow stretching across the floor, and for the first time in our marriage, he didn't try to comfort me. He didn't try to lie. He just watched me, his expression shifting into a chilling, clinical detachment. "You were never supposed to find that, Elena," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing every trace of the warmth I had fallen in love with. "It was supposed to be easy. You'd go to sleep, you'd sign the papers, and we'd move you to a nice facility where you could actually be cared for. You're a very difficult woman to help. You're stubborn. You're obsessed with this pile of bricks." "This pile of bricks is my home," I spat, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. "And this marriage was a lie from the moment you realized what my inheritance was worth, wasn't it?" The back door creaked open. Margaret stepped into the kitchen, her arms laden with grocery bags, her face bright with a false, cheery smile that died the moment she saw the tableau before her. Me, white-faced and clutching the bottle. Mark, standing like a statue of ice, and her phone, lying open on the counter like an open wound. She didn't miss a beat. She dropped the bags with a heavy thud, the sound of glass breaking inside one of them, and sighed, a long, weary sound of disappointment. "Oh, Mark, I told you to be more careful with your things. Now look what's happened. We have a mess to clean up." She looked at me then, not as her daughter-in-law, but as a structural flaw in a house she intended to own. "Give us the phone and the bottle, Elena. Let's not make this more dramatic than it needs to be. You're outnumbered, you're sick, And quite frankly, nobody is going to believe a word you say." My stomach lurched, a wave of cold nausea washing over me as I realized the depth of the trap. They had spent months telling my friends I was failing. They had documented my delusions to my own doctor. To the world, I was a woman losing her mind, and they were the saints trying to hold the pieces together. I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to slide, a dizzying realization that my fortress had become my cage, and the bars were made of the very people I had trusted to keep me safe. "We have a mess to clean up," Margaret repeated, her voice as calm and clinical as if she were discussing a spilled glass of milk rather than the systematic poisoning of her daughter-in-law. She stepped toward the stove, her movements efficient and practiced. Before I could move, she grabbed the pot of soup and poured it down the drain. The thick, savory liquid swirled away, taking the evidence of the drops with it. The steam rose in a final, mocking cloud of garlic and herbs. "Stop it!" I choked out, my voice cracking. I turned to Mark, my heart pleading for a spark of the man I had married. "Mark, look at me. Tell me this isn't real. Tell me you didn't know she was drugging me. Tell me you didn't plan to take my thumbprint while I was unconscious." Mark didn't look at me. He stared at a knot in the mahogany floorboards, the same floorboards I had spent a week staining during our first summer here. He shoved his hands into his pockets, his shoulders hunched as if he were trying to disappear into his own skin. "It's for your own good, Elena," he muttered to the floor. You've been so stressed. The house is too much. We just wanted to make things easier for everyone. We're a team, a family. You're the one who made it all about ownership and deeds." "A team?" I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my throat. "You've been poisoning me for months, Mark. I thought I was dying. I thought I had some horrific neurological disease. And you sat there every night, stroking my hair and telling me to drink my soup. How could you? How could you look at me every day and do this?" "Don't be so melodramatic, Elena," Margaret snapped, wiping the sink with a paper towel. She turned to face me, her eyes devoid of any warmth. "It's a mild sedative and a cognitive dampener, nothing permanent, just enough to help you realize that you aren't fit to manage these assets. And don't bother looking for your briefcase. Mark, tell her." Mark finally looked up, but his eyes were vacant, flat. "I took it to the office, Elle. The power of attorney forms are already drafted. I've been talking to your doctor, Dr. Eris. He thinks your deterioration is consistent with early-onset dementia. I've been keeping a log of your episodes, the times you forgot the stove, the times you didn't know what day it was. I have it all documented." The room tilted. They hadn't just been drugging me, they had been building a legal case to strip me of my personhood. My episodes were the direct result of their nutrition, and they were using the symptoms to prove I was incompetent. "You've been lying to my doctor," I whispered, the horror sinking deeper. "You've been gaslighting him and me. Why, Mark? Why would you do this to me? I loved you. I gave you everything." "You gave me a room in your museum," Mark snapped, his voice suddenly sharp with a bitter, long simmering resentment. "This house, it's always been about you. Your grandmother's legacy, your business, your vision. I'm just the guy who lives here. I lost my job 6 months ago, Elena. Did you even notice? No. You were too busy polishing your crown moldings to see that I was drowning in debt. My mother is the only one who actually looks out for my future." The first twist hit me like a physical blow. He had lost his job? The parent-teacher conferences he went to every week were a lie. He had been pretending to work for half a year while his mother plotted to seize my estate to bail him out. "He's a good man, Elena," Margaret said, stepping closer, her presence looming and oppressive. "He deserves a life that doesn't involve being a servant to your ego. We've already contacted a buyer for the house, a boutique hotel group. They've made an offer that will set us up for life. All we need is your signature on the transfer deed. Or, if you continue to be difficult, your thumbprint while you're having one of your deep sleeps." "I will never sign it," I said, my voice shaking with a cold, sharp fury. I will burn this house to the ground before I let you sell it to a hotel." Margaret smiled, a thin, cruel line. "Oh, I don't think so. See, there's another detail you aren't aware of. While you were so confused last month, Mark had you sign a few preliminary documents. You thought they were for the tax audit, remember? But one of them was a change of beneficiary on your life insurance policy, and another was a mortgage application against the house. We already have $500,000 in a private account, Elena. You're already broke. The business? I've been responding to your clients as your assistant. I've told them you're taking an indefinite medical leave. Your firm is already half dissolved." The second twist felt like the floor finally gave way. They hadn't just targeted the house, they had systematically dismantled my entire professional life while I was too drugged to notice the notifications on my laptop. They had isolated me, impoverished me, and were now moving in for the kill. "You're monsters," I breathed, my legs finally giving out. I sank into a kitchen chair, my head spinning. "You're actually going to kill me, aren't you?" "Kill you? Heavens, no," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft whisper. "That would be messy. No, you're just going to go away for a while. A very nice, very private sanitarium in the mountains. We've already made the arrangements. You'll be safe there, Elena, away from all this stress. And by the time you're clear-headed enough to complain, the house will be gone, the money will be moved, and nobody will believe the ravings of a woman with a documented history of mental collapse." I looked at Mark, desperate for a shred of the man who used to read poetry to me in the garden. "Mark, please. You know this is wrong. You know I'm not crazy." Mark looked away, his jaw tightening. "Just sign the papers, Elena. Don't make us do this the hard way. My mother, she's just trying to protect our family. If you just cooperate, we can make sure you're comfortable. Otherwise—" "Otherwise what?" I challenged, my spirit flickering back to life amidst the wreckage. "Otherwise," Margaret said, pulling a second, larger bottle from her apron pocket, "we stop being so mild with the dosage. It would be such a tragedy if you had a permanent, irreversible reaction to your medication before the papers were finalized. Think about it, dear. You have until tomorrow morning. Mark, take her to her room, and lock the door this time." Mark stepped toward me, his hand wrapping around my arm. His grip was cold, firm, and entirely devoid of love. As he led me toward the stairs, I felt like a prisoner being led to the gallows. But as my foot hit the first step of the staircase I had sanded with my own hands, I felt a sudden, icy click in my mind. The fear didn't vanish, but it transformed. It turned into a cold, calculating weight. They thought I was a broken bird, trapped in a cage of their making. They thought the drops had erased the woman who had built an empire from an inheritance and a dream. They were wrong. As the door to my bedroom clicked shut and I heard the turn of the key, I didn't cry. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited for my heart rate to slow. I had built this house. I knew every secret passage, every loose board, and every hidden corner. They thought they had trapped me in my sanctuary, but they had actually locked themselves in with a woman who had nothing left to lose. The silence of the room was thick, but for the first time in months, it wasn't oppressive. It was clarifying. The icy click in my mind had severed the last thread of affection I held for the man standing on the other side of that door. I waited until I heard their footsteps retreat down the grand staircase, the mahogany steps I had polished with such hope, now echoing with their treachery. I didn't have much time. My limbs still felt like they were made of lead, and my vision occasionally swam, but the adrenaline was acting as a temporary antidote to the sedatives. I crawled toward the walk-in closet, my fingers trembling as I reached for the baseboard behind a row of winter coats. I had designed this closet myself. I knew about the 3-inch hollow space beneath the floorboards intended for hidden treasures. Inside, wrapped in a silk scarf, was my old work phone, a backup I'd kept for emergencies and never told Mark about. With fumbled movements, I powered it on. The battery was at 12%. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, rhythmic thumping that felt like it would burst through my skin. I didn't call the police first. I called Sarah, my lawyer and oldest friend. Elena? Why are you calling from this number? Her voice was sharp, professional, yet laced with immediate concern. They're poisoning me, Sarah, I whispered, the words sounding surreal as they left my lips. Mark and Margaret. They've drugged me. They've stolen $500,000, and they're planning to take the house tomorrow morning. I need you to listen very carefully. I spent the next 20 minutes in the dark, relaying every detail. The drops, the transfer, the doctor Mark had manipulated. Sarah's silence on the other end was cold and vibrating with fury. Don't drink anything else, Elena, she commanded. I'm calling Detective Miller. He's a client of mine. We're going to set a perimeter, but we need that confession. If you can get them to say it again while the phone is recording, they're finished. I didn't sleep. I spent the night sitting on the floor, leaning against the door, listening to the muffled sounds of my husband and mother-in-law laughing in the dining room below, clinking glasses of my expensive wine to celebrate a victory they hadn't yet won. The morning light crept through the heavy velvet drapes like a pale, sickly ghost. At 8 a.m., the key turned in the lock. Margaret entered first, carrying a tray with a single bowl of soup and a fountain pen. Mark followed her, his eyes red-rimmed, looking like a man who hadn't slept but was determined to finish a grim task. "Morning, sunshine," Margaret said, her voice dripping with a mockery of kindness. "Time for your breakfast, and then we have some paperwork to settle so you can finally rest." I looked at the bowl, then up at Mark. I made sure my hand shook as I reached for it, playing the part of the broken, drugged wife one last time. "Mark, please," I whimpered. "Just tell me why. We were happy. We were building a life." Mark looked at the wall, his silence a physical weight in the room. He didn't defend me. He didn't look at me. He just stood there, a hollow shell of the man I loved, his cowardice more painful than Margaret's malice. "Answer her, Mark," Margaret urged, her eyes fixed on me like a hawk. "Tell her the truth. She's going to a lovely facility anyway. She might as well know why her perfect life had to end." Mark finally looked at me, and his voice was flat, devoid of any soul. "I was never enough for you, Elena. Every time I looked at this house, I saw your success, not ours. I saw the money I didn't have and the power you wouldn't share. My mother is right. You're a tyrant in a silk dress. We're just taking what should have been a joint asset from the start." "And the poisoning?" I asked, my voice a mere breath. "The drops in my soup?" Margaret chuckled, a dry, papery sound. "It was the only way to get you to shut up and listen, dear. You're far too stubborn when you're lucid. A few more weeks of this, and the dementia would have been permanent enough to keep you tucked away forever. Now, sign the transfer deed, or we'll just wait for you to pass out and use your thumb. It's your choice." I looked at the fountain pen, then back at them. I felt the vibration of the phone in my pocket, the signal from Sarah. The trap was sprung. I stood up. I didn't stumble. I didn't shake. I stood tall, the lead in my veins turning into liquid fire. I threw the bowl of drugged soup at Margaret's feet, the porcelain shattering against the floorboards I had lovingly restored. "I didn't build this house to be a museum for your greed," I said, my voice ringing with a terrifying, crystalline clarity. "And I certainly didn't build it to be a cage for a coward and a parasite. You didn't just steal my money, Mark. You stole the only person in this world who was blind enough to think you were worth loving." The blood drained from Mark's face, a ghostly pallor replacing his arrogance. Margaret's eyes went wide, her mouth opening to spit another insult, but the sound was drowned out by the thunder of boots on the staircase. "Police! Don't move!" The bedroom door burst open. Detective Miller and 3 officers flooded the room. Margaret tried to hide the bottle of sedatives in her apron, but she was too slow. They were tackled, handcuffed, and read their rights on the very spot where they had planned to erase my life. Mark was sobbing, a pathetic, high-pitched sound, while Margaret screamed about ingratitude until she was dragged out of the house she had tried so hard to steal. The legal battle was swift and brutal. Sarah didn't leave a single stone unturned. The 500,000 was recovered from the private account Margaret had tried to hide. The medical records were exposed as a fraud, and Dr. Arris was stripped of his license for his role in the diagnosis. Mark and Margaret were sentenced to 10 years for attempted poisoning, fraud, and conspiracy. 6 months later, I sat on my veranda, the spring air smelling of lilacs and fresh rain. The heavy velvet drapes were gone, replaced by light, airy linen that danced in the breeze. I had spent the morning in the garden, planting new roses under the willow tree. My hands were steady. My mind was clear. I looked at the house. My house. It no longer felt like a fortress or a cage. It was just a home, built on a foundation that had been tested and had held firm. I realized then that they hadn't taken anything that actually mattered. They had tried to break my spirit, but all they did was burn away the rot, leaving only the strength I had always possessed. I took a sip of my tea, the warmth spreading through my chest, and whispered to the wind. A house can be rebuilt, but a soul that survives a fire is indestructible.